Record.
What's up, everybody on YouTube? This is Know Your Mind, episode 2, and a bit earlier today, I just realized that I really should be giving examples of assumptions, and I promise this is going to be very important because there's so many damn assumptions, and there's no way I'm going to be able to cover them all. What I might actually do eventually in the future is create a master list of examples of assumptions that most people have. I won't be able to cover every single one of them, but I might do like a 2-3 hour podcast, which I might put on YouTube, explaining each assumption and how these assumptions are, assumptions and not necessarily something that is true. Because there's so many damn assumptions. Like, I could spend my whole entire YouTube and podcasting career, I suppose, just talking about assumptions of the mind, because there's so many of them that I could make like 10-volume book with 200,000 pages talking just about assumptions, because there's so many of them and they're so common. The mind it's very easy for the mind to make assumptions. It is very hard for the mind to trying to look at the facts honestly and if not objectively. We'll go into that one as well, because that's a big one. But we'll try and go, but it's easier to for the mind to create assumptions rather than to look at the facts and reality as honestly and objectively as possible, which is not really possible. It's not possible to be completely objective, but it is, something that you can do. And that's the first assumption, assuming that reality is either objective or that we can actually know and understand objective reality. And there's many reasons why this is actually not true. There's a physicist, a scientist by the name of Donald Hoffman. You can look up Donald Hoffman on YouTube. He talks about how reality is, what we see as reality is an illusion. It's not real. You could think of it as like a computer's. When you look at a computer and you see the icons of a computer and all this other stuff, that's not the computer's, codes and everything else. That's not the reality of the computer. It's just an interface to help you communicate with a computer and help you to understand a computer. And in the same way, reality is the same way. And, some people might argue that, well, you wouldn't step in front of a train because that would kill you, and that would show that reality is real and all this other stuff. But just like you wouldn't move an icon on your computer screen to this trash, you wouldn't move yourself in front of a train because you think reality is not real. Because it doesn't mean that. It means that what we see as reality is not real, and it is guided by evolution. Some of the things that he's talked about, and this is a book that he has called The Case Against Reality. It's a pretty good book. I've read a little bit of it, and it definitely is eye-opening for sure. It's the first assumption, because a lot of people have this idea, this assumption that reality is objective and that we can know objective reality. Maybe reality is objective, but there's nothing saying that we can actually know objective reality objectively. There's no proof that this can be even done. This is just an idea that we have in our heads from science and other people. It's not true. We don't know if that's true. There's no proof for this, and there's proof showing the opposite. And by the way, just because this is an assumption, something is an assumption, doesn't mean it's not true. And just because an assumption is true doesn't mean that it's something to assume. Because some things that people think are true can be wrong, and that's the problem with assumptions, is that they leave you stuck in the past. They leave you stuck in your mind, and they leave you stuck with suffering and all kinds of other problems, like I've talked about in the last part of this series about personalization. Well, not personalization, that's a different thing, although that's also an assumption, which I go into as well. I called it personalization yesterday, but it's not. That's a different thing. So that, I guess that's the second assumption, which is that when somebody does something, they're doing that to you, and that means that person is annoyed with you or whatever, and it's just not necessarily something that's true. We talked about this a little bit, like when it comes to somebody's being annoyed at you or whatever in the last episode. So there's many of these assumptions. The assumption of rights, the myth of rights, it's really an assumption that people have, especially in the United States and in the West. Like, you have a right to property and free speech and all this other stuff. And in reality, what you have are privileges. They're not rights. Because if they can be taken away, they're not, they're not rights. There's a funny bit from George Carlin that goes into this really well. I'd recommend you look it up. It's a really good little point of view. It's really accurate because most people kind of get stuck on this rights thing where it's just not that accurate. The myth of blind justice, this assumption that justice is blind, also kind of goes back to the idea that you can be objective. And the answer is you can't. Not completely. And so you're going to be biased in some way. I think that's almost a given. Like, if you think that you're unbiased in some way, I can almost guarantee you that you probably are biased in some way. It's just a guarantee because it's just a part of the mind and how the mind works. And if you believe that you are objective, if you assume this, then you're not going to question your worldview. It's an easy out for the mind. It's an easy out that makes the mind feel and seem superior. Like, oh, I know more than you do. You may not necessarily say it out loud. It may not necessarily be as overt as that, but that's ultimately what it comes down to. Because if you assume yourself to be objective, then you can, attack other viewpoints with, with no consequences, because you're correct, you're true. And so, that creates a lot of problems, and I could talk many, many hours about why that is. And there's so many some examples of this. It's crazy to me because we are told that we can be objective, and that science is objective, and all this other stuff, when that's just not something that's never really been proven. That's something that never can be really even proven, because it's not a physical thing that can be proven or disproven for the most part. And so we just assume this, and they assume this. They have this idea of objectivity, and when somebody comes around and questions that, they may think this person is a religious person or whatever it is, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean that. Often it does, but that doesn't mean it has to. And that's the problem with assumptions, is that when you think your point is right, you have to make other points wrong. And I don't think right and wrong is an absolute. I think there are things that you can be right on and things you can be wrong on. And when you assume that you're objective, or that your points are objective because they're given to you by science or God or whatever it is, then you do use these absolutes in many cases. In many cases, I've seen this You know, it's kind of a crazy thing. So there's many of these examples I could give, and I could take you. It could take me hours and hours and hours to do this, because there's so many examples that I could go on and on and on and on and on until you will just give up, because there's just so much of these assumptions. Assuming malice, when you have this idea that somebody's doing this to me deliberately and all this other stuff, kind of goes back to the personalization aspect, where you assume that somebody's angry at you rather than just being angry at, their day at work or whatever it is. Same basic idea as assuming somebody's annoyed, but there's many different aspects to this. Assuming that somebody is going to give you lasting happiness. There's no guarantee of happiness. There's no guarantee of lasting happiness. And in my experience, lasting happiness is not even possible. And I will be going over impermanence in another video in this series, because this is really one of the most insidious ways that the mind works. And if you're not aware of this aspect, the mind will use this and will try and get you to agree with its point of view, because its survival is based on this stuff. Most of the things that are impermanent, like food and people and all this other stuff. So
messages, Bobby, chaotic events, attached. Messages, Bob.
Yeah. Assuming that that the world cares about your misfortunes, or should care. Assuming that, and this is a big one. Like there's a bunch of big ones here, and some people do this where they are trying to become a victim, and they're just like, this is my problem, the world needs to listen, and all this other stuff. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't be listened to, but many people are not going to be able to do that. They have other things they have to do. They have busy days, and if you're trying to create this victim mentality in your head and you're spreading it, don't be surprised when people aren't going to listen to that. We have that happening right now, and that's really one of our problems we have in society right now, is we have this victim narrative going on like crazy, and I will probably be making an episode about that as well in the series, because there's some pretty big ones there. So, assuming your ideas are true, correct, moral, right, righteous, whatever it is. Assuming that what skepticism is, and this is what most people do with skepticism, is they're skeptical of pretty much everything but their own points of view. For instance, like you see this with atheists and religious people in some ways, mostly an atheist thing, where they're skeptical of every religion and every kind of spirituality and everything else, but they're not skeptical of the flaws of their own thinking and the flaws of their methods in which they're using to, get across their atheistic point of view to a Christian or whatever. And it's pretty crazy. Like, the mind is like a hammer, in these cases where it like hammers these opinions into people in such a way that you find yourself kind of like being a soldier. There's a book that I want to read eventually. I might make a book review either on this channel or on my podcast, A Deeper Perspective, which I will be linking the Spotify and the Apple podcast links below. But anyways, this book is talking about this method, which is I'm talking about the soldier mindset, where your viewpoints are like a position a soldier takes, and then from that point he attacks others and he has to defend his own viewpoints rather than being open-minded and being the scout. And the scout, is somebody who has to really understand what is happening, understand reality. Even if he hopes that something is a certain way, he will report accurately or as accurately as possible what's actually going on the battlefield or whatever, so that he can actually help his group or his whatever or himself to survive and to help others to become to survive this war, whatever that war is, of ideas or whatever it is. And it's not always that concrete, but I think we all can embody both of these, but some of us embody most people I think embody the soldier mentality more often than the scout. That's what I've noticed anyways. Could be a assumption, but next assumption is what's called, and this is something really, it's actually kind of insidious as well, because it doesn't look as overt as how I'm going to explain it. And a lot of these don't necessarily look as overt as they seem to you. Sometimes they're very subtle assumptions, and you may have a time becoming aware of them. But what I forgot what the next assumption was. The next assumption is about something called confirmation bias, which is where because you assume your point is correct, you will be cherry picking, reality and viewpoints and all this other stuff to suit your own viewpoint. You may not necessarily even realize that you're doing this, but it's something that happens. I gave you an interesting example from my own life, and I became aware of this kind of like on accident, kind of, because I was just, I was pretty radicalized at one point. I've talked about this a little bit on my other channel, Mindful Politics, a long time ago. But basically what I was talking about there was how I used to become radicalized. One of the things that I noticed myself how when, let's say a good example is I was reading this article one time, and in the back of my mind I was noticing the article's points in my head, and it was like knowing that some of them were true in a sense, but in the front of my mind I was still making arguments against those points. Turns out those points were kind of wrong anyways, but that's the problem with the media, is that it's very easy to become what's the word I'm looking for? I don't want to say controlled, but become convinced that the media's point is correct, because the mind is kind of subjective sometimes. The mind is not subjective, sorry. The mind is suggestive, especially in certain states and whatnot. And especially if you believe the media, and if the points seem really correct, and depending on your particular worldviews and stuff like this. And what I want you to try and do over the next couple of days is try and become aware in your own life of the assumptions underlying things in your mind. Become aware of any assumptions that you have in your mind, if possible. Whatever those assumptions are, maybe those assumptions have to do with being, have to do with Republican points of view, or liberal points of view, or Christian ones, or atheistic ones, or whatever they are. Try and become aware of these assumptions. Try and become aware of the not only try and become aware of these assumptions, but try and become aware of the effects of these assumptions as much as possible, and become aware, especially to your emotional states and your behavior when those assumptions, based on those assumptions. Like, for instance, if you notice you are assuming that your viewpoint is objective because it comes from the media or science or whatever, try and notice what that does to your emotions, your behavior, your mind. Does that make you more open-minded or less? This type of thing. Try and become aware of this and write it down if you want to. That's not necessarily mandatory, but write it down. That this part's not necessarily mandatory, but I think it can help to flush out the assumption even more. Just write down the assumptions that you have, because when you write these things down, it's really interesting. Something that I was against for a while, because it's just like some of the things that I have in my head are embarrassing and stuff. But write these thoughts down, write these assumptions down. I think that's true for anything, actually. Write these thoughts down or assumptions, and write down the experiences and the behaviors that come because of these assumptions. And write down if you want these behaviors to continue or not continue. And if you don't want them to continue, maybe you could write some things down or think about some things to decrease the soldier mindset in your own head. Maybe it's meditation, maybe it's whatever it is that works for you in this situation. So.
One notification. Messages. 10 minutes ago. Bobby. Left channel on. Right channel on. Stop button. Right. Left. Recording duration. Recording duration. 23 minutes. Left. Right. Stop button.
So anyways, this is be well informed. Sorry about the loud voiceover. It scared me too. Anyways, this is be well informed. And I hope you all have a good day. I'm going to copy and paste the Apple podcast and Spotify podcast links and put them in the description below. And if you want, I recommend you check out my podcast. I have a bunch of stuff over there, a lot more stuff over there than I do over here. But a lot of them have to do with the mind, and some of them have to do with assumptions. Another kind of assumption, I think, is an assumption in some ways as well, is something called a cognitive distortion. And I don't know if most people consider that to be an assumption, but I do for many reasons, because you're assuming that certain things are true, and I will be going over cognitive distortions in another episode, but of this series, because it's very important to what we're talking about. And I'll probably be making more episodes about assumptions, even though they won't be directly as obvious as assumptions, because assumptions are probably the most common thing to the mind. In my opinion, like there's other things, but a lot of them revolve around and are created by assumptions. So anyways, this is Be Well Informed, and I'll talk to you in the next episode.